Respiratory system, as we were talking about it since the last exam, we said that it's going to have some functions that are very closely tied to cardiovascular system. So that's going to be nice for us. So not only do we see functional ties in terms of getting oxygen and carbon dioxide to our cells and from our cells, but also, you know, when we were talking about the cardiovascular system, these systems where we have tubes, and when we have smaller tubes, it's harder for things to get through. When we have bigger tubes, it's easier. To a certain extent, we see that same physical structure with the respiratory system as well. So it's a series of tubes, and we're looking to move things through those tubes. Now, with the respiratory system, it's going to be kind of a inverted tree where we're going to have really large tubes starting out, almost like we saw in terms of the large arteries leading the heart, and then it's going to branch and branch and branch to smaller and smaller tubes. And just like the cardiovascular system, we're going to finally get down to very, very small tubes where we can actually do exchange. So with the cardiovascular system, we've got arteries to arterioles to capillaries. And capillaries is where it's thin enough and small enough to be able to do all of our exchange with the tissues. Here, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start out with a big trachea. We're going to go down to big bronchi. Then we're going to go to bronchioles. Just like we went arteries to arterioles, we go bronchi to bronchioles. And then after bronchioles, we're going to have what are called alveolar ducts and alveoli. And alveoli are going to be these little stacks that almost look like little grapes. But the walls of them are going to be almost exactly the same as the capillaries. They're going to be a single flattened layer of epithelium, as thin as you can make it, so it makes it really easy for gases to exchange. And so those alveoli are going to be all these little bubbles that actually make up the lungs, and makes the lungs very, very spongy. And so if we decide like next week, like I say, you guys can send me an email if you're interested in doing it. If you want to visit the lab, we can maybe set up a time. We do, like I said, we have a human cadaver there, and you can see and you can feel the lungs. And we actually have a set of pig lungs that we can inflate and stuff like that. And you can see they start out something like this, and when you inflate them, right, they get like 2 to 3 times that size, and that's because of all these little spaces. It basically looks like a sponge. But with a sponge, all those little spaces are going to hold water, and with the lungs, all those little spaces are going to inflate with air, right? And they're going to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with capillaries that are going to be surrounding them. So that's what we'll see as we look in the respiratory system. Now, the good thing about the respiratory system is that it's pretty simple in terms of its structures. So rather than, for instance, like cardiovascular system or endocrine system where we have organs that are all over the place, respiratory system, right there. It's just contained in a few different organs, and organs that a lot of people are already familiar with. Okay? So, in order for the respiratory system to do its job of getting oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from the cells, there's a few different steps that are going to be necessary. And you see the 5 steps right here. Okay? The first one is ventilation. And ventilation, what that means is moving air into and out of the lungs. So on a certain level, people look at that and they're like, well, yeah, obviously, that's probably the whole of what it does. But that just means we have to have a way of moving air from outside in the atmosphere to inside of the lungs, and then when we're done with it, being able to move that air from the lungs to the atmosphere again. That's what ventilation is. Now that's very important, but unless we actually get that whole exchange like we were talking about, it doesn't do us any good. It's like if we were eating, food or something like that, or something that wasn't food, like you're a little kid and you're eating like pennies or something like that, right? That's all good. You may feel full and stuff like that, but we're not going to be able to digest that. It's not going to be able to cross across our body wall, and we're not going to get any nutrients from it, okay? So if we were ventilating the lungs, but nothing was exchanging across the wall, it wouldn't do us any good, okay? So ventilation by itself is not good enough. So we have ventilation getting air into and out of the lungs, that's 1. 2 is going to be gas exchange between the blood and the lungs. And that's going to be from the alveoli, those little bags or sacs, to what we call the pulmonary capillaries. So we're going to have all kinds of capillary beds that are surrounding these alveoli so that we can pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. So that's 2. We need gas exchange at the lungs. 3, gas transport in the bloodstream. Now when we look at that function, That's not really a function of the cardiovascular system, right? That's a function of the cardiovascular system, not the respiratory system. So that's in a way, like we said, that's critically tied, we critically tie this system with the cardiovascular system. So the respiratory system can't fully complete its job unless those gases are being transported by the cardiovascular system. So that's another critical aspect, gas transport in the bloodstream. Then we need another gas exchange between the blood and the body tissues. So the same type of diffusion that we had going on up the lungs between the capillaries up there, the alveoli, you need to have the same thing going on with tissues, dropping off oxygen, picking up carbon dioxide. Okay? And then lastly, cell respiration. Cell respiration is basically going to be, the cells requiring the oxygen in order to make ATP and putting out that carbon dioxide. That's what kind of drives this whole process, is that each of those cells uses the mitochondria to produce ATP, and they need oxygen, and they put out carbon dioxide. And so that is going to then be a necessary function as well. It's going to drive all these other things too. Okay? So we're going to talk about each of those different critical steps in turn. All right? Okay, so before we do that though, because those are the functions, we're going to look a little bit at the structure, at the anatomy of the system. We said that this should be pretty straightforward. Okay? So, for the anatomy of the respiratory system, we're going to have an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. And sometimes you hear that phrase, like when you go to the doctor and they're like, oh, you have an upper respiratory tract infection or a lower respiratory tract infection. The dividing line there is the pharynx, okay? And look at that word, it seems a little bit weird, right? It says pharynx, not pharynx. A lot of people want to put the Y and the X together. I don't know if they learned the alphabet or something, I don't know. But it's called pharynx. So pharynx is actually the back of the throat, okay? Underneath the pharynx is another structure that's called the larynx, which I have my pointer over right now. And the larynx is where, this is the last place where we actually have a single tube, and we're going to subdivide into two separate tubes. We're going to subdivide into a trachea down below that, which is the air tube, the windpipe, and we're going to subdivide into the food tube, which is the esophagus. So if we're talking about the pharynx and the oral cavity or something like that, all of those passages are actually shared between like the digestive system and the respiratory system, right? You can breathe through your mouth, you can swallow things through your mouth, etc. But at the larynx right here in the back of your throat also receives the things you swallow and the air. But at the larynx, that's where we're going to divide them. The larynx is also where we have the vocal folds and things like that. And so it's an important section where we're going to then continue on lower than that and get down to exclusive respiratory structures. But in any case, the separation between upper and lower respiratory tract is just superior to that larynx. So like right through, and I can be good enough, let me get a different color, like right through here, okay? So upper respiratory tract is going to include things like the nasal cavity and the sinuses, the oral cavity, and the back of the throat, which are called the pharynx. Okay? Lower respiratory tract is going to start at the larynx, where we start to have that separation. Then it's going to be trachea, bronchi, which are these branches going into the lungs, and then further on down the bronchioles and the alveoli. Okay? So when we look at the respiratory system, we see that, like I said, it's pretty compact. And each of these different structures, though, are going to have some function for respiratory system. Now, when we look at the lungs, we've got a left and a right lung. They both sit within the thoracic cavity, but they also individually sit within a pleural cavity. So a long time ago, we talked about like visceral and parietal pericardia. And here, we have visceral and parietal pleura. So there's going to be a slippery membrane on the surface of the lung and a slippery membrane that lines the cavity so that when the lungs are moving in the cavity, they have that nice kind of slippery movement to them. And in this case, it actually, those membranes have another important function. It keeps the wall of the lung stuck to the wall of the cavity. So that little bit of fluid right there, as if you took like two pieces of glass, you put a little fluid between them, and you had them like this. It's very hard to actually separate them like by pulling them this way. You might be able to slide them like this, but it's very difficult to pull them that way if there's just a little bit of fluid between them because of what they call the surface tension of the water. That works to our benefit with the lungs. That little bit of serous fluid on the surface of the lung and on the inside of the cavity keep the side of the lung stuck to the side of the cavity. And that's critical because what we're going to find is that in order to get air to move into the lungs, what we're going to do is we're going to be moving muscles that actually change the volume of the cavity. So when we move the walls of the cavity, because the lung is stuck to the cavity, the lung is going to move with it. And so it's going to cause the lungs to open up and then get smaller and open up and get smaller because we're moving the sides of the cavity with muscles that are out here. Okay, so right and left lung. One other thing before we move off of this slide, as you can see, is that the right lung has 1, 2, 3 lobes to it. See how there's 2 dividing lines here and here? And the left lung only has 1, 2 lobes to it. Dividing line right there. So, again, it's one of those weird things where it's not exactly symmetrical. You can also see here, see that little indentation? What creates that little indentation right there? The heart, right. So the heart, like we said, points a little bit to the left. And so it tends to impact that left one a little bit more like that. So it's possible that's why it only has 2 lobes as opposed to 3. Hard to say. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a tour, a bit like we did for, say, cardiovascular system or something like that. And we're going to tour through the different structures that are part of the upper respiratory tract, work our way down to the lower respiratory tract. Okay? Okay. So one of the first things we start with are what are called the paranasal sinuses. And the paranasal sinuses, right, nasal is talking about nose, right, and paranasal is going to be, these are going to be spaces, air-filled spaces that are near the nasal cavity, okay? And so the paranasal sinuses are located within bones that surround the nasal cavity. And so when you talk about having a sinus infection or something like that, these different spaces that are enclosed by bone have direct connections to the nasal cavity. So if you get a nasal infection, right, you get like green or yellow mucus and stuff like that, that shows you have a bacterial infection in there. It can directly spread to the sinuses. And those sinuses, there's a big frontal sinus, there's a big space here. There are spaces within the maxillary bone right here, so there's some sinuses there. There are some sinuses within that bat-shaped bone, which is called the sphenoid bone, which is deep in there, and within the ethmoid bone. So any of these sinuses here are warm, air-filled spaces. They help to kind of lighten the skull. They may help a little bit in terms of warming the air that comes in and moistening it, because they're all mucus-lined, because we said any cavity that goes to the outside has a mucus membrane to it. So these are all mucus-lined bone surrounded spaces that connect to the sinus cavity, or connect to the nasal cavity. So that's why you can get a sinus infection when you have like a nasal infection. Okay, and you can see some of them right here. So for instance here, the cross-section of the frontal sinus right there. Here's a cross-section of the sphenoidal sinus right there. And then the maxillary sinuses are off to the side. So because this is a mid-sagittal cut down the middle, we can't see those maxillary sinuses, but they're right here. Okay? All right. Other things that we see of interest as the first part of the respiratory system, we can see places where the air comes in, right? So it can go through your nostrils or nares or external nares as it comes in here. You can go into your oral cavity as well if you're a mouth breather. But in the nasal cavity, what we have are these ridges like you see in here as well. These ridges are called conchi. Okay, so the CH gives it a K sound, so these are nasal conchi. And there's a top one, a middle one, and a bottom one. So they're called superior and middle and inferior. And so what happens is as the air comes in, it tends to go by these different grooves and stuff like that, and it gives it a chance to warm and moisten the air before it sends it further back in the respiratory system. So we've got the nasal cavity there with our conchi in it. We get the air towards the back here, and it enters into the pharynx. Now remember we said the pharynx is the back of the throat, right? But the back of the throat, that pharynx has 3 different areas. Up here, okay, The back of the throat is called the nasopharynx. It's the throat part that connects to the nasal cavity. Okay? So that's in here. Throughout here is called the oropharynx because the back of the throat that connects to the oral cavity. And then when we get down lower, we have this little section down here, which is called the laryngopharynx. So it's the last part of the back of the throat before we transition into the actual larynx. And the larynx, like we said, is where the vocal folds are located and where we do the separation between trachea in the front and esophagus in the back. And so this that you have here in front of that tube, this is trachea right here. The esophagus is posterior to that. And it has cartilaginous rings to it that work to hold it open. You also have thyroid cartilage, which is bigger in guys than it is for women. That's why they have a bigger, quote-unquote, Adam's apple. That's the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid gland, that hormone-releasing gland, encircles it like a butterfly right around here. But any of those cartilaginous structures help to hold the larynx open, the trachea open, so we can make sure that there's always a passageway for air going through. Okay? Okay. One other thing before we get off this picture is that we see when we get to the larynx, there's also this flap, like you see right here. Okay? This flap is called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is critical because the epiglottis serves kind of as a trap door, right? So if we are swallowing something to drink, or if we are trying to breathe, or say we are trying to speak and we need air to go this way, in essence, through the vocal folds, okay, then what we're going to do is we have to, at the last time, either close off the air tube or open it up, right? So if you're swallowing something, like you're swallowing a drink, you want the epiglottis to close over the trachea and shunt the food or the drink posteriorly into the esophagus. Okay? So it's always working to either let air through and be open, or to close the trachea if we're allowing food and liquid to pass through. Now, of course, it gets very confused if you are eating and drinking and trying to talk at the same time, right? That's what you hear about people choking, because it doesn't know what to do. It's supposed to be closed if there's something comes down, and it's supposed to be open and speaking and trying to, produce a sound. And so, it's kind of getting caught halfway in between, and the drink getting caught on it and causes you to cough, etc. So it's a very important mechanism in allowing our systems to work together. So this is just showing us a zoomed-up shot of the larynx itself. We see the hyoid bone at the top of it right here. The hyoid bone is always very interesting. It's one of our 206 bones of the body. But this is the only bone that does not directly articulate or form a joint with another bone. It's way up at the top of here. It's embedded within different types of tendons and things like that. There are muscles of the tongue that come down to it, muscles of the throat that come up to it, and kind of suspend it way up here. If you watch like Law and Order and those types of things, they'll also say that this is one of the indicators somebody gets strangled. The larynx or the hyoid bone is often broken, so it'll get broken because of that blunt force that goes on there. So we have the hyoid bone at the top. We have the thyroid cartilage down beneath it that kind of forms a protective circle around the larynx. And then down below that, we have what's called the cricoid cartilage. And then we just get the trachea, where we have our hyaline cartilage rings, which work to hold it open. Now this is a posterior view here on the right, and we can see that big epiglottis here. So that flap would come down and would come and fold over and cover the trachea down below it. The hole down here is called the glottis, and the epiglottis comes down and covers the glottis and shunts the food or drink posteriorly. Okay, so that's the larynx up here. Now we're working our way down to the rest of the respiratory system, the lower respiratory tract. So we said we have bronchi, right? The bronchi are going to branch off of the trachea. Now we're going to find that there are 3 different kinds of branches. So there are going to be primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi. Bronchus is singular, bronchi is plural. So you have 2 bronchi, 2 primary bronchi that go to and from each of the lungs. Okay? Now, after that first branch, we find that we have other bronchi that will go to the lobes. So you can see here the secondary bronchus going there, secondary bronchus going there, and secondary bronchus going there. Okay? So So these are second branches, so they're called secondary bronchi, and then you're going to have tertiary bronchi coming off of those. Okay? Now after the tertiary bronchi, you get down to bronchioles, smaller branches still. And the bronchioles start out with terminal bronchioles, or internal means end. And here, when you see the zoomed up box right there, once we get down to this level, this microscopic level here, now we're down to structures that are small enough to allow gas exchange to start to occur. All those other tubes up top are just about getting the air from one place to another, back and forth and back and forth. No exchange, like arteries and veins, right? Wall is too thick to allow exchange to occur. But here, with the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar duct, and now all these little bubbles that we call the alveoli, single alveolus, these are the gas exchanging structures that we need. And there's millions and millions of these little bubbles that we call alveoli that are going to give us a lot of surface area and a lot of places where we can exchange gases. So this zoomed up picture right here shows us the last respiratory bronchioles coming down, shows us the alveolar ducts, leading into these kind of bunches of breaks like you see here. We can have a whole bunch of alveoli, they call it an alveolar sac, but each individual bubble is an alveolus, right? And when we look here and here, you can see each one of those individual alveoli are surrounded by capillary beds because we want to be able to exchange all this oxygen and carbon dioxide very easily. So this is actually a microscope slide of our different lung tissue where we can see the different alveoli. And so, for instance, this right here, this is one alveolus right here. Here's another alveolus right here. Here's another one right here. Okay? They're all have very, very thin walls to them. Again, simple slump epithelium, one flattened cell layer thick, which makes it very easy to transport gases. Now notice every once in a while, you'll see these almost smaller circles like we see here. Okay? These things that we see here are those capillaries. Capillaries, as you can see, are right next to the wall of the alveolus. So again, here's an alveolus right here. So for gas exchange, right, the gases only have to go across that thin wall of the alveolus and across that thin wall of the capillaries surrounding it. So that's a very, very efficient system that way. This picture right here is a scanning electron micrograph from an electron microscope. That gives more of a 3D effect. We see all the vibrations. These are all different capillaries. In the three little circles, those look like rocks. Those are the alveoli. You can see there's just capillaries all over them because it gives us more area to be able to exchange gas. Because you can imagine, right? You're taking breaths in and out right now. When you take a breath in, it's only like a second or so when your lungs are being inflated before now you're exhaling again. So in that second, you've got to do a lot of exchanging of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you've got tons of these different alveoli and tons of capillaries that are doing that immediately as soon as the air arrives in there. So it's important that it happens very quickly. Okay? Okay. So, now what we've done is we've done kind of a big tour. We've looked at the different structures of the respiratory system, working from the big ones, the upper respiratory tract, working down to the smallest ones, those alveoli with the surrounding capillaries. But now what we need to do is we need to understand those different types of physiological mechanisms that allow the system to do what it needs to do. So we need to understand how we get air in and out of the lungs. We need to understand how oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. How do they go across the membrane? What forces them? Is there like a plasma membrane protein that escorts them across, like facilitated diffusion, or is it active transport, or what? Active diffusion is pretty easy because of my love. But we need to understand that. We need to understand how oxygen and carbon dioxide are getting poured in the blood. We already have hints about that. We talked about cardiovascular system. So, but we have to put these things together so we understand how the system works. So, ventilation, or the breathing mechanism. So how do we get the air moving into and out of the lungs? That's the first step. Well, when we're talking about inspiration, that's the same as inhalation. And when we're talking about ablation. Okay? Now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move volume of air from out here, which is kind of the atmosphere, to inside of the lungs. And that's often called, we often call it the, I'm going to have to take it out instead because this doesn't like to write. So we often call it the intra means within, alveolar space. Okay? So the intra-alveolar space within the alveoli, we know the alveoli make up the lungs. So we're trying to get the air to move from the atmosphere into the alveoli of the lungs, right? So, and then when we exhale, we're trying to get it to move from the intra-alveolar space back into the atmosphere. So those are the two places where we're trying to move this volume of air. And so the question is, how do we do that? So, what we start with is we start with, in essence, the pressure that's inside and outside the lungs. Now, the pressure that we talk about, when we talk about atmospheric pressure, you get back to almost like weather reports and stuff like that, where it's like, oh, okay, it's high pressure here coming in, we got low pressure over there, it's raining over there, etc. Okay? So when we have high and low pressure, we're talking about high and low pressure in terms of like a gas. Okay? If it's high pressure, that means like usual, we have a lot of things packed into a very small space. Okay? That's high pressure. So for instance, if we were going to do this class in my office upstairs, number one, you have to find my office and hardly anything over it is. That's okay. As long as you're good, I'm good. But the one TV right there. Okay? But if you're going to do that in my office, it would be a high pressure situation, right? My office has like 3 seats in it, and there's more than 3 of us. Okay? So it would be a high pressure situation because we have a number of individuals in a very small volume. Okay? Meanwhile, if we can have the same number of individuals in a much bigger space or bigger volume, then that's a much lower pressure. And it's lower pressure you need to see, you can practically lay out on the table, etc. Okay? So the same thing in terms of molecules. If we have a given set of molecules, and we put them in a very tight space, and then there's high pressure, they're bumping into each other and stuff like that. If we put them in a much bigger volume space, then that's a low pressure environment instead. That's the difference. How many molecules and how big is the space? Okay? So, in a way, that's a bit like concentration I was going to talk before. Concentration, when we were talking about diffusion, had to do with how many molecules we have in this area compared to how many molecules we have in this area. Okay? And so for things like air, oxygen, and stuff like that, we can use that concentration or changes in pressure to move the molecules in the air from one place to another. Okay? So if we have, for instance, high pressure up here and low pressure here, the molecules in the air will naturally move from high to low going into the lungs. So what we need to do is we need to make the pressure in the lungs lower than the pressure out in the atmosphere. So the way we do that, like we were talking about the room, is if we can make this room bigger, the pressure in here will go down. And as soon as it's lower than out there, the air starts moving into the lungs. It's like suction, right? When you use a straw, in essence, you're doing the same thing. You create low pressure at this end, higher pressure there, and so you get movement through the straw. Okay? So, what we'll do, what we end up doing is, like I said, we change the size of this cavity. And the way we do that is we use muscles to move the walls of the cavity out. The main one we use is an umbrella-shaped muscle down here called the diaphragm. Okay? So the diaphragm, as spelled here, diaphragm, which is true, that's spelled D silent, okay? The diaphragm, for resting breathing rate, like you guys did right there, the diaphragm actually does about 70% of the action of getting you to ventilate the lungs. It's an umbrella-shaped muscle, and when it's relaxed, it's shaped like this, and when it contracts, it flattens out like this, okay? So you can imagine if it's sitting up here, and then it flattens out, that's a whole lot more space the lungs can then expand out to. Okay? So we use diaphragm, we contract the diaphragm, we make it flat, that gives us more volume here. The other thing we use are the external intercostal muscles. Okay? So external means outside, inter means between, and costal or coastal means ribs. So this is these are the muscles that exist between the ribs, the rib cage. And when we contract them, there's 2 layers. There's an external layer, which is one we're talking about, there's an internal layer underneath it, between each of the ribs, okay? When you contract the external layer, what it does is it brings the rib cage out this way. So the diaphragm contracts goes down here, the rib cage, the external intercostal muscles contract, and it spreads out this way. So now, we increase the cavity this way and this way, we create a bigger volume, and now the pressure is going to go down, okay? And then as soon as it goes down lower than atmospheric pressure, the air is going to move from here, from the atmosphere, into the lungs, into the intravenous space. Okay? Now remember, we said that pleural membrane, that serous membrane, is keeping the surface of the lungs stuck with the wall of the cavity. So while the muscles are moving the wall of the cavity, the lung is stuck with it, so it has to move too. And that's why the lungs will expand that way. So it's not like a balloon where we're blowing air into it. It's a bit of the reverse. We're actually drawing the lungs open, and because that creates a bigger space, that decreases the pressure here, and then the air rushes in from high to low. And now we ventilate the lungs. We inspire the lungs. Okay? All right. Now, that's basically inhalation. We create a bigger volume, which is lower pressure. So now the air moves from high pressure to low pressure comes in. The exhalation is actually a little bit easier. Okay? So, surfactant, you'll hear about surfactant a little bit as well. Surfactant is actually a substance that's created alveoli. We know that they're going to be deflating, and stuff like that. The surfactant is made so, number one, they don't stick together, they don't fully last and kind of stick their walls together to each other. It decreases what's called surface tension. So we like them surface tension, fluid tension, so that it has elastic recoil, but we don't want them to fully flatten out and stick to each other. So there's a surfactant that's secreted down there that kind of keeps them from fully flattening, which is pretty important. But expiration is actually the reverse process of inhalation, if it makes sense. Okay? So, for inhalation, we actively contract the diaphragm, and then the external intercostal muscles, and we increase volume, decrease pressure, and in order to make the air go out, we just relax these different muscles. So the diaphragm, which is flattened, is going to come up. The external intercostals, which are holding the ribs out, they're going to allow the ribs to come down again. So we're compacting this area. As we make it smaller, all the air goes in, right? Higher pressure. And now once the pressure in the lungs is higher than outside the atmosphere, the air is going to move from high to low, and it's going to leave instead. Okay? Now, it doesn't have to be that different. Generally, the pressure out here is about 760 millimeters of mercury. That's how they put the measurement they use for it. 760 millimeters of mercury out here. If you can make it even something like 758 millimeters of mercury down here, that's enough of a gradient for it to go high to low moving in. Same thing. As the diaphragm and everything comes in, if this goes like 761 or 762, that's enough to be high pressure here, low pressure there, cause to move out. Okay? So, for the most part, the relaxation of these different muscles allows us to shrink this cavity down, increase pressure, causing it to move out. Now, if you're doing like forceful expiration, like you're blowing out candles on your face or something like that, then you're going to recruit some of the muscles, right? There's some internal intercostal muscles in here that those contract while you pull the rib down instead of just letting them come down, right? And then if you contract your abdominal muscles here, pull, right? You're really low and you feel it down there, right? And so when you contract your abdominal muscles, it pushes some of these abdominal organs up, which also decreases space in your respiratory cavity. And so that's when you push that air out a little bit faster. So you can forcefully exhale, and like you recruit these extra muscles. But if you're just doing normal breathing, it's just relaxing the other muscles and allowing that space to get smaller again. Okay? Okay. So this is a picture here that shows you what I was talking about, right? So here, on the right side, you see 760 millimeters of mercury at atmospheric pressure, and if we increase capacity out, the diaphragm goes down, and the rib cage moves out. That allows the ribs of the lung to get bigger, and because of the volume, the pressure goes down, like 758 millimeters of mercury. That's enough difference that the air will go into the lungs, going from high to low. Okay? So all we have to do to reverse that is make these things go in instead. So if we bring the rib in, we bring the diaphragm up, then the area is going to get smaller, and then it's got to get, the pressure has to get higher. Right here it says 760. If it's 760 in the atmosphere, it's not going anywhere. If it goes 761 or 2, like you said, that's enough to actually drive it out instead. Okay. Okay. So, at this point, what we've done is we've done the first of the different processes. We've talked about how we get the air to go into and out of the lungs. But what we have to remain is talk about gas exchange, how we can get it off the alveolar wall, talk about gas transport, how we get it into the cell, and then talk about exchanging out of the cell. Those are fairly easy topics. And I think, to a certain extent, we should be able to tackle those easily tomorrow, as well as have some time to review, much like we did the last game. Okay? So I think what we'll do is we'll stop here for now, we'll pick up from here tomorrow, finish up the respiratory system, and then go over any questions that you may have for the next exam. I'll try to have some, like I did last time, maybe some questions that we can go over together, and kind of practice with, things like that. Okay? All right. Okay, tonight, yesterday was blood and heart anatomy. You have one tonight that is blood vessels, is that right? Yeah.
I couldn't find the model to chapter or exercise 19 in the lab, but I'm guessing
19 was like physiology, something like that. So, unfortunately, we won't be able to do that because there's no way we can do like the full ECG and things like that. I think we go because it's like the stuff we were talking about in lecture. So there's a kind of companion lab where it's on, ECG and things like that. Yeah. We do the same lab for the HL we do on